Hello there and welcome to Discover History, the podcast where people from all walks of life discuss the topics they are passionate about. On today's episode, we are discussing integrated education in Northern Ireland. Joining us is Dr Nora Murray-Cavanagh. Hello Nora and welcome to the show.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm well, and yourself?
Good, very good. Thank you for inviting me on.
It's a pleasure to have you on. Why don't we start with you telling us about your involvement in integrated education and why it's such an important issue for you personally?
Sure. We are now in the year 2022 and the first integrated school in Northern Ireland. So that's a school that purposefully educates children from different religious backgrounds, Catholic, Protestant, opened in 1981. So we had the 40th anniversary last year. And 40 years later, there are still less than 10% of kids in Northern Ireland that go to mixed schools. And to me, it's entirely fundamental about how to have a peaceful society and by extension a peaceful world, that you have to educate children together. And I am involved in a couple of ways. One is that my family were heavily involved in setting up some of the early schools and are still involved in running them. And I myself was involved in setting up a charitable organisation called Integrated Alumni, which is a network of past pupils and supporters to build on all that work that was done of setting up the schools. So to support and promote integrated education in Northern Ireland.
If you look back to before 1981, just to give people some context, how did the situation arise where segregated education based on religious affiliation actually became the norm?
There are certainly plenty of historical factors, and they do feed into why has been this sort of this limit placed on the progress of integrated education, and part of those things are to do with political structures, and part of those things are to do with communities within Northern Ireland who have suffered in various ways and who need to, what they see as, protect their cultural identity. So if we look, way back, decades and centuries around the establishment of educational structures, in Northern Ireland, across the Republic, and the rest of the UK, there will be various bits of it where, in retrospect, we look and we shake our heads and we say, how did that happen? So when there's a beautiful play called Translations by Brian Friel, and he looks at how language was used as a tool of colonization, and so actually very much in part of that where you would have had native Irish language speakers that historically then they were told to educate their children in English, and that's how the education was formally delivered. So you have all of that cultural hangover. Then within that, with the more recent sort of the Troubles period, you had what are segregated schools. I mean, I think that's a really important way to look at it. You have the state system, although it is, in name, inclusive and welcoming of all. You have that being seen as sort of the Protestant sector. And then you have a separate way of, it's still publicly funded, but it's delivered through the Catholic Church. And so they would be the Catholic schools. And another really important thing about integrated schools is about the inclusive nature of it. In Northern Ireland, we really like to divide people, and we are, it's still very heavily segregated from an academic perspective. So you have grammar schools and secondary schools in a way that is different in the rest of the UK. So I now live in Scotland, where in Edinburgh, where I live, I think about a quarter of the kids are at fee-paying schools. So that's a way in practice to segregate. But if we look back at Northern Ireland, even within then, you have religious segregation, you have academic segregation. At 11, we tell children, because of the results of an exam, that they're stupid or they're not, and they get to, go based on the number of places available that year. So the historical context is around cultural identity, and it's around how political structures created systems that were going to be inherently segregated.
Do you think that segregation of children from such a young age resulted in them developing into adults who viewed people from different backgrounds as separate from them and not to be interacted with?
That's it in a nutshell, isn't it? You know, who do you end up spending time with? Who do you end up marrying? You know, who do you end up what organizations and companies do you end up working for and working with? So that normalization of what we think of as entirely normal process of having cross-community relations, that should be an organic thing. It shouldn't have to be worked on. There is a bit of a fudge, a bit of a modern fudge, and it's labelled shared education, and there's quite a lot of sort of newer research about that. But actually, you're still essentially bussing children around and saying, this is the identity of this group and this is the identity of this group. And I can see the appeal of it because you don't need to go for that, that really fundamental change. But it's not going to be as impactful and as effective just by the nature of it. So there's some really interesting modern educational research around looking at kids from integrated schools who go off to university and kids from segregated schools in Northern Ireland that go off to university, and looking at their subsequent friendship groups. And even then, when they have been introduced into what is a very mixed population in many ways, the now adults who came from integrated schools have a more religiously diverse group of friends. And so that plays out then across the piece. And if you bring it way back to how simple it is around identity for the children in the school. Children do not exist in isolation. Children exist as a function of their social network. And so if you look at the impact on the families, because your child goes to a friend's house and then you get to know the parents, or you speak to somebody when you're picking up or dropping off from school, or all of these things. And there's the Northern Ireland Council for Integrated Education, which is a support body to promote the development of integrated schools in Northern Ireland. They published a book a few years ago called There Were No Desks, a collection of oral histories about integrated education in Northern Ireland. And there's a story that really sticks out for me, and I think it really demonstrates the power of it and the impactful nature of what integrated education does. So I'll just read from the book, if that's okay.
We would love to hear the story.
There was a little girl who was 8 at the time and who had been to another school. Her parents were part of the group who opened Oak Grove Primary School. One was Catholic and one was Protestant. So what we would call a mixed marriage. A few days after the school opened, the little girl came home, and as she was taking off her school bag and raincoat, her mother said, "How did you get on today?" And she said, "Fine." Her mother said, "How do you like your new school?" And she said, "Fine." Now, we all know what it's like pulling teeth out kids. How did you get on at school? Her mother said quite casually, "What's the difference between the new school, Oak Grove Integrated Primary School, and your old school?" The mother was quite taken aback when the little girl said to her, "Mummy, actually, I never told you before, but at my old school, I never talked about you. I talked about Daddy, but I didn't talk about you. At Oak Grove, I can be proud of both of you." That's what it's all about. Even at the age of 8, a child knows there are things you don't talk about. If only everybody in Northern Ireland could be proud of everybody in Northern Ireland.
It's so tragic that an 8-year-old understood the social dynamic to such an extent that not talking about a parent with a different background meant an easier time amongst our peers.
Yeah, out of the mouths of babes, and it's very interesting around how culturally sensitive everything is, and around how that child knew not to tell the mum that she didn't talk about her. All of these really abnormal, traumatic things that we are doing to kids in that society. So really a lot of work to do, and really a lot of people doing a lot of great work. And there has been some very helpful progress in the last year, where the Integrated Education Bill, building on the Good Friday Agreement, which is not today or yesterday, but finally has been put into legislation in Northern Ireland. There will be integrated education will be considered sort of almost as a default for for new schools and changes, so that the pushing back that families and parent groups and community groups have had to do for a long time to set up and transform schools, hopefully that should now become more straightforward. when you look at it and when you look at the polls, you see that there is great community support, but people feel very disempowered for a number of reasons. And these huge structures of, what already exists with regard to state schools and what already exists with regards to Catholic education, it's a real uphill struggle for people to change that. But from my perspective, I was really fortunate that my family were part of a group who decided that they couldn't put up with it anymore, and that did, first of all, open a primary school, as I say, and then I was in the last year of that primary school. And then the Department of Education said, no, you can't just open a secondary school straight away. And they said, what about these P7s that are going to leave, So they pushed ahead and they did it, and they opened the secondary school as well in Derry. So,
picking up on mixed marriages and effects on children of this union, who were the people in the mid to late 70s advocating for integrated education? Was it mixed marriage couples, their support group, or was it a wider movement?
Yeah, I mean, certainly if you are in a marriage in Northern Ireland across community, or mixed marriage, as it's called, you would be much more aware of the subtleties of what that means, or not so subtle, actually, just, actually what that means. And you would have lost friends, you would have lost family members because of that decision that you'd made. So certainly, those kinds of families would be involved. But it wasn't just that. It was, many people who really stood up for what they believed to be the right thing, and to say we can no longer accept for our children that segregation is a way that they should grow up and be brought up. And we cannot have that as our educational structure, because it was the 70s in Northern Ireland. And, I'm very lucky that I grew up in a much later period. So my memories of those things are not as stark as my parents, for example. But our bus was, stoned going to school because it was an integrated school. Like, there were bomb scares, and you would have to go, like Derry Girls has now sort of shone a light on that, I think, in a really interesting way, because of the way that Lisa McGee has written it. It's, it's very accessible for people, but also really shocking, So when in one of the really early episodes, and the aunt in that family says, oh, there's a bomb scare and the bridge is closed, and I had an appointment to get my fake tan done, just about how normalised all that really. So that was the 70s. And my mum, who is now retired, was the principal of Oak Integrated Primary, and was a teacher in a school in Derry before that. She, had done some work abroad, and what on earth brought her back to, literally a bomb site, an army on the streets, and all of that. But, something in her and the people that she, went around with, saw that was their community, and they couldn't shy away from it. And so they had to do the work to set up the schools and really push for change.
It must have been an extremely difficult situation for those early campaigners, having to deal with family breakdowns, intimidation, and even bomb scares. But that aside, what was the reaction from the wider community and the authorities to these new integrated schools?
Well, I guess with respect to the political and civil service structures, it's such an unusual thing to start a new school, and it's a big deal. And so there wasn't really that support. And I guess that's where, NICE really came into being, the Northern Ireland Council for Integrated Education, because they, are a real support to schools around, setting up, management, employment law, all of those things. And schools in Northern Ireland are run by boards of governors. So they're not like here where I live in Edinburgh, my kids go to a school that's run by the council. And there is, parental input, but not in the huge and meaningful way that you see in schools in Northern Ireland. So you had people who had jobs, full-time jobs, families with young kids, and having these meetings to talk about how to set up a school, find a location, how to work out financing for a building. People and the department wasn't funding them until the day when the school opened. So these were people who were, multiply mortgaging their houses, and really, it's just phenomenal when you think about it. And as a parent myself, like with 3 young kids, I'm knackered. I don't know how they did it, but obviously, the whole point of it was so meaningful and so important, and the alternative was so abhorrent to continue.
It does highlight how resilient and ambitious people will be when a cause is so important to them. Do you think the decision by the authorities to withhold funding until day one of the school year was part of a pushback against integrated education? Perhaps an attempt to deter people because it's so difficult to set up a new school in the first place?
I would like to say it's not so bad now, but there was a real reticence for promoting change, because if you look at the government position of, well, our schools are open to everybody and we don't exclude anybody. If that's your belief, then you can see why it's hard for you to see that another alternative is important. And by the same token, the Catholic Council for Maintained Schools, the Catholic education system, they were coming from a historical and cultural place where, for them, their red line was going to school with Protestants means that we can't, continue our Catholic ethos, and that's just, it's not played out as being true in real life. Catholic kids that go to integrated primary schools make their first communion and their confirmation, and who comes to their first communion party? Their wee Protestant classmates, and a celebration around diversity, and not just tolerance. You have to get there first with tolerance, but beyond that, a celebration of diversity in your community. So you can see that there were both political and cultural reasons and baggage about why it didn't happen. And as I say, I hope it's getting less. What you can't just open a whole pile of new schools. So this sort of phase that we're in now is looking a lot at what's called transformation. So existing schools, working with them around how you become an integrated school, around how you really work on your ethos, on your catchment, particularly if you're So if you're a new integrated school, it's maybe a bit easier in a way because everybody's taking a punt. But if you're transforming, there's an existing identity. And so how do you welcome what is, quote unquote, the other side into that, and not have it feel like it's always a Catholic school.
It's part of the idea behind the transformation of schools that as new teaching staff come into the profession, with the concept of integrated education as the centrepiece, and an older generation who perhaps identify more with a particular identity retires, we will see this gradual change.
I think so, and it has to be school-led and it has to be community-led. So transformation could never be imposed on a school. It wouldn't work. So it has to, very much has to come from the organisation and the community it's cited in.
What was the effect on the early campaigners, considering the upheavals that they endured? Did it put them off opening up more schools or attracting more support?
I guess we see the people who stuck around and kept fighting, right? Because that's who you see. So that group of what became the Foyle Trust for Integrated Education, which would have been the people that were involved in setting up schools, so Oak Grove Integrated Primary School and Oak Grove Integrated College in Derry, and then subsequently another little school. So these people are hugely inspirational, inclusive and tenacious, and just amazing. Like what they've done is just really amazing. And what's really interesting is there's so many of them all across the country. It's just such a really simple and obvious message around educate the children together, get the kids in the same school, and to do it in spite of the circumstances, and to say, we acknowledge these challenges, and we will go ahead and we will keep pushing for this, not just for our kids and not just for our family and not even just for our bit of our community, but for the whole country. And then it ripples out. If you're invested in a peaceful and more functional world, start where you are.
What impact do you think integrated education has had on those who attended the schools?
Whenever I started primary school, so that would have been about 10 years after the first secondary school. So you would have had a couple of kids, coming out, like maybe a couple of hundred, but there was no past pupil network. There was nobody that you looked up really and you saw where they were going. But what the integrated alumni, when we got together to say, actually, it's really important for these kids to see what happens afterwards, is we have been involved in, obviously COVID put the kibosh on it for a while, but we've been involved in doing a roadshow around the schools to go back in and to say, I went to integrated school, this is how it impacted me, this is what I'm doing in my life now, ask me anything, And those were really culturally really important, because they're, again, just harken back to how we like to divide kids in Northern Ireland. The integrated schools are comprehensive, all inclusive. Mm-hmm. So it didn't matter what you got in your 11 plus, if you got, the highest mark of that session in the year, or if you didn't sit it at all. So that idea of being a mixed ability school is really frightening to some families, and I get it. You hitch your parental wagon to the academic, culture, and you think, I want the best for my kid, and they have to go to a school that gets good exam results, and they have to get good exams, and they have to go to university, and they have to become this, that, and the other. So for me to go back and to say, so I went and I studied medicine, and I'm involved in these national things in Scotland, and that's to say, if that's the path for your child, then that's possible. But also to say, and we have people who are entrepreneurs and started their own business. We have, people who've been involved in training in trades. And here's why that's important, because academic routes aren't for everybody, and neither they should be. The world doesn't work without electricians and plumbers, and, and so just that sense of that you're part of a wider culture with history. So the integrated alumni, the establishment of that, is not just about going beyond the schools and talking to people about why they're important. It's about going back into the schools and reminding people who are there why it's important, and to create that network. Ask me anything. Are you going to move to Edinburgh? Drop me an email. Are you interested in medicine? Totally happy to talk to you about those things. So that you have a family in the broadest sense established.
Were these roadshows just to integrated schools?
Integrated schools.
Okay, just to integrated schools. Did you find that it gave pupils and parents confidence going forward, as they could look back at the achievements of previous pupils?
Yeah, you'd hope so, wouldn't you? So it was with the children, so it was with the pupils. So then they would go home and whatever they, sort of said to their parents, and the feedback was good. And we would hope to, that more of that can happen now again as we go back to normalise face-to-face stuff.
Do we know anything about how pupils at segregated schools feel about integrated schools? Do they feel that perhaps they're missing out on something?
So I guess there's two things I would say to that, and one being that you go to your school in your community, and it's the people that you grew up with on the streets that you grew up with, and then their families that So to do something else is a bit odd, a bit frightening. So I am sure that kids at integrated schools are still looked at as a bit weird by lots of people in Northern Ireland, and still a bit niche, and I wonder what the threshold will be for that to be not niche anymore, but certainly it has to be more than 10%, whatever we're sitting on just now, 8 or 9. And then there is this section of society in Northern Ireland who are just in total denial about a segregated system, and who say, well, I went to a mixed school, and you say, don't tell me what, or even I went to an integrated school when it wasn't. I say, tell me what school that was. You say, oh, right, okay. So I wonder what the percentages were of Catholic kids in that, essentially, for all intents and purposes, Protestant school. I wonder how the cultural elements of the, across the community were celebrated and discussed. Because in integrated schools, you prioritise talking about the difficult stuff. And you do, before even you work with the kids, you do training with the staff, and you say, you go through all of the crazy things that are totally taken for granted in Northern Ireland. How does a Protestant cut their sandwiches? What foot do you kick with? What sports do you play? So do you play Gaelic games? Do you play, camogie and hurling and Gaelic football? Or does your school play rugby and hockey? all of these, these subtle markers, and you work with people about how to deal with segregation and conflict. And that doesn't happen in a school that's not integrated, because it's not in the DNA of that school.
It's fascinating how segregation impacts culture to the extent that the perception of the other is littered with such myths and cliches. However, despite just under 10% of schools being integrated, has there been a wider impact on society where these ideas and cliches don't resonate with the younger generation?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's wider than Northern Ireland, like across the UK and the Republic, you see, much less slavish adherence to religious history, don't you? And people who are, actively attend, a religious celebration or another. People, don't necessarily get married in churches anymore. And you can have a humanist ceremony or a civil ceremony, and that's much less of an unusual thing than it used to be, So there's that. But also, as it creeps into like popular life, you now have elected politicians in Northern Ireland at both local government and national governmental level who went to integrated schools. That's huge, isn't it? You have what is now an extremely significant political force in Alliance. That is a huge cornerstone of their vision for the future is, integrated education. So that's really changed in the time, that I've, since I was at school. And then you have celebrities of other kinds, musicians, artists. Oliver Jeffers, who is known in, any English speaking home that has kids books, is bound to have an Oliver Jeffers book about crayons somewhere, and he went to an integrated school. And Carl Frampton, the boxer, is the supporter of integrated education, so as that becomes more normalized and talked about, people go, oh yeah, actually it's not that weird and that niche, is it? So
has there been a transition with the alumni taking over the process of campaigning for more integrated education as the generation who started it begin to retire?
Good question. I think that really has to be a key role for the alumni, and we've seen that particularly in recent years around the progress towards the Integrated Education Bill and Act and the movement towards that. So there was a lot more coordinated campaigning than I can remember for anything previously, actually. And you have people who are activists and lobbyists, sort of for other things, who are able to bring their skills and toolkit and, coordination to this topic. So yeah, I think that definitely is a mark of progress. I think the other thing is, you have alumni who are now teaching in the sector. You have, certainly second generation. I don't know about third generation, but like that have their kids at integrated schools, and so that normalization into the culture is really important. But it can't just be about that niche sustaining itself. It has to keep growing.
You mentioned earlier about the change in legal context. Has this resulted in the state taking over more from the family-led movement it began as? Or is it more of a joint enterprise?
I still think it is very community-led, but maybe the barriers that people previously faced and campaigning groups previously, maybe they are fewer. That would be my measured response to that question.
Unfortunately, segregated education is practiced in many countries globally. Has the reforms in Northern Ireland been seen as a blueprint or even an inspiration for other communities wishing to introduce integrated education? I'm thinking of Palestine and Israel, for example, where there have been attempts to bring young people from each side together. But has it been done in education?
Yes, there are hand-in-hand schools in Palestine and Israel. So, that is very much, again, a political conflict. And there are lots of things to learn, in both directions. My dad has put together a directory of interdenominational schools across the world. So, everywhere from Australia to, you name it. And so it really speaks to human nature, We don't want to be segregated. There are always people everywhere in every context who see the value in working together and to doing that from day one with the kids. Because what we've had to do is to say, are we going to try and retrofit peace and reconciliation on society, or are we going to just try and grow a less toxic society? So yes, there are inspirational people working hard all over the world in all sorts of divided communities. And again, how do we grow up? Do we call things cross community because we believe that we're a divided community, or do we say communities because we think Catholic communities and Protestant communities are different?
It is really interesting. And if we examine even the difference between East Coast and West Coast Scotland, the West Coast has a long history of interfaith rivalry. I grew up in Edinburgh, and my experience was that faith schools were a tiny part of the overall system, and as such, faith played really no role in our education. Therefore, the idea of what constitutes community was everyone, irrespective of religious or ethnic background. And your peer group really was based on mutual interest as opposed to religious identity.
There's two things that I might suggest. So I think the West of Scotland has huge issues with sectarianism, and all of that, Rangers and Celtic stuff has been adopted in Northern Ireland. Like, how did Northern Ireland end up supporting Scottish football teams? Anyway, that's a whole other podcast. But I would definitely pick you up on thinking that Edinburgh is immune, right? So I have kids, and when they're going to school, you are offered a school or a Catholic school, right? That's what we're offered to. That you have a catchment school and that you've got a Catholic school if you're not putting down for your catchment school. So I was just, wow, right, didn't really expect that at all. And the other thing is, if you look here in Edinburgh, not that long ago, there was 2 schools in, I want to say, down towards Dalkeith, who are meant to have a shared campus. But the shared campus literally just means that they can access the same areas, but not at the same time. They're not allowed to play in the playground at the same time. They don't sit in the dinner hall at the same time. So, come on. Just, no. I was incredibly shocked to come here and to think that I had left that behind, and to read that in the newspaper. I was really surprised.
Looking to the future, do you think integrated schools will continue to grow, reaching and even exceeding the 10% mark?
I think 10%, when we get there, I think that will be a huge milestone. I think, getting into double digits is going to be so powerful, but it feels like it has taken an age to get there. How, because we're already 40 years. What's it going to take to get to over 10%? I hope not 50. But it is now all to be seen. Now that, the legislation has changed, maybe even coming out of the pandemic, maybe even financial recession, these are all things that play into, big, huge societal change. So say, for example, in my sector, so I work in medicine and healthcare in the NHS. And for a long time, we've been trying to, look at different ways of promoting access. So, we were a pilot site for video calls. And it wasn't happening. Within 2 weeks of the pandemic starting, every practice in Scotland had access to video calls, and lots of them used them. So what can we take out of the worst things? So out of the troubles was born integrated education. What about now? We are. I really dread to say post-pandemic. We're certainly mid-pandemic, whatever we are. And, another financial crisis on the cards, and, all of these things, possibly, another independence referendum, out of that time of great turmoil, what's going to happen. And what happens in Scotland with regards to independence has a huge impact on what happens in Northern Ireland. And what is now a very disunited kingdom, there's going to be huge political repercussions in the next few years. And the IndyRef 1 and Brexit, all of those things have really played out in Northern Ireland. To have those political conversations. This is what's happening in Scotland. To have the impact of Brexit at the border, there are, 300 or 400 natural crossing points of the border between North and South. So it was never going to be straightforward. Brexit didn't exist in Northern Ireland conceptually in the same way that it did in the places that voted for it in England, you know. So what do I see? I think we're really at a tipping point. I think we have a whole lot of really good, really motivated people doing really hard work. I think the political landscape has changed, and so a bit of functioning government in Northern Ireland would be nice. So yeah, it remains to be seen, but you would hope that momentum is there really for the kids and families in Northern Ireland.
Well, Nora, thank you so much for coming on to discuss what has been a fascinating and still evolving topic in history. And that's it for this week. If you would like to join the discussion, or have any questions, or would even like to be a guest on the show, you can email us at discoverhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on social media at Discover History Podcast, except Twitter, which is at History Podcast. Thanks for listening.